On a chilly Thursday afternoon in the heart of a quiet suburban town, Jamal Thompson, a seasoned FBI agent, found himself navigating through an ordinary day that would soon spiral into one of the most life-changing events of his life. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the tree-lined streets, where children played and the sound of distant traffic hummed in the background. Jamal had just finished a long day of surveillance on a sensitive undercover operation. He had not planned for any interruptions, all he wanted was a peaceful walk to unwind before heading home. Jamal, tall and athletic with a calm demeanor, blended into the crowd. He wore a jacket and jeans, his badge securely tucked under his shirt, a routine that allowed him to go unnoticed by the public eye. His life in the FBI, especially his work undercover, required him to keep a low profile, even in his day-to-day interactions. This was part of the reason why he had chosen to live in this small town, far from the high-pressure cases and drama of his assignments in major cities. Here, he could gather his thoughts and escape the chaos, even if only for a moment. But as he turned the corner onto Maple Street, something felt different. A subtle tension hung in the air, something he couldn't quite place. Jamal noticed the presence of a police car parked at the end of the block, an unusual sight in a neighborhood where police activity was rare. The officer in the car was scanning the street with an intense focus, his gaze darting from house to house as if searching for something, or someone. Jamal didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just another routine patrol. He kept walking, lost in his thoughts, but as he passed the officer's vehicle, he felt a strange weight in the air. His instincts as an FBI agent told him to be alert, but he shrugged it off. Suddenly, the officer's voice cut through the quiet evening, stopping Jamal in his tracks. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Jamal turned to find a tall, stocky officer approaching him with an expression of suspicion. Officer Richards, his name tag read. The officer's uniform was crisply pressed, but his face, hardened and brimming with authority, held an unmistakable air of superiority. He wasn't smiling. "I need to see some ID," Richards barked, his tone sharp and demanding. Jamal, confused but maintaining his calm, stood still. It wasn't uncommon for officers to ask for identification, especially when there was any suspicion of unusual activity, but something in the officer's eyes made Jamal uneasy. He hesitated before reaching for his wallet. "I'm not sure what this is about, officer, but I'm—" "You don't get to ask questions," Richards interrupted, stepping closer. The officer's voice was stern, but there was an edge to it, like a fuse had been lit and the tension was about to explode. Jamal handed over his ID without another word, trying to gauge the officer's behavior. Richards took the card and examined it carefully, his brow furrowed in disbelief. It was a few seconds before he spoke again, but Jamal's heart rate started to pick up. There was something off about this encounter. "You got a problem, officer?" Jamal asked, his voice calm but with a hint of annoyance creeping through. "I don't know what this is about, but I need to get home." Richards ignored him, still scrutinizing Jamal's identification with a frown. "I'm not convinced you're who you say you are." His words were sharp, colder than before. "Stay right here." Jamal's eyebrows furrowed. His training as an FBI agent had prepared him for confrontations, but nothing had prepared him for this, the racial profiling he had heard about but never experienced personally, not in this quiet town, not in broad daylight. He knew he had to stay calm, there was no room for impulsiveness. He had been in countless tense situations before, but this felt different. There was a suspicion in the officer's eyes, something Jamal couldn't shake off. Was it because he was black? Was that the real reason he was being detained? As he stood there, doing his best to keep his breathing steady, Richards turned and walked back to his patrol car, leaving Jamal standing on the street. He could see the officer talking into the radio, likely running his ID through the system. Jamal had no doubt the officer was questioning his identity, but there was something else at play here. He had been pulled over many times in his life, as many black men in America had, but this felt more deliberate, more invasive. And now, Jamal's mind raced with possibilities. Why was this officer acting like he was a criminal? When Richards returned, there was a different energy in the air. The officer's jaw was set, and his eyes held a spark of aggression, a glint of authority that he hadn't had before. "I'm placing you under arrest," he said, the words coming out flat and final. "You're resisting arrest and giving false identification." Jamal's stomach dropped. This couldn't be happening. The officer's eyes bored into him, filled with suspicion, but Jamal couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had done nothing wrong. He tried to process what had just happened. He had been polite, had answered the officer's questions calmly, and had even provided the proper identification. And now, this officer was accusing him of being someone he was not? Of resisting arrest when all he had done was stand still? He opened his mouth to protest, but Richards raised a hand. "Don't say a word. I know what's going on here." The officer's voice was cold, devoid of empathy. "You think you can walk around here with an attitude, thinking you can just intimidate people with your badge. I've had enough of people like you. We don't want your kind here." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. The words hit harder than any physical blow. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. Richard's words carried a weight of malice, something Jamal recognized all too well: racial prejudice, a deep-seated belief that Jamal's very existence was a threat. He was a black man in a predominantly white town, and in Richard's eyes, that made him guilty of something, even if there was no evidence to back it up. Jamal stayed calm, his mind racing with everything he had learned about keeping his cool in these situations. His years of training as an FBI agent kicked in. He had learned how to navigate difficult situations, how to diffuse tension, how to handle suspects who were much more volatile than a racist cop. But there was something about being on the receiving end of this kind of treatment that threw him off balance. He was being accused of something he hadn't done, and all because of the color of his skin. "Officer," Jamal said, his voice steady but firm, "I am an FBI agent. I'm not resisting arrest. I've done nothing wrong, and I don't appreciate being treated like this." But Richards wasn't listening. Instead, he motioned for backup, his movements quick and deliberate. Jamal could feel the crowd of onlookers beginning to gather around, their whispers and murmurs growing louder. A few neighbors had already started filming the encounter with their phones, which only seemed to provoke the officer further. It was in that moment, as Jamal stood in the middle of the street, that everything changed. His entire life, his career, his identity, nothing seemed to matter anymore. He wasn't an FBI agent. He wasn't a professional law enforcement officer. To this officer, to the crowd that was now watching, he was just a black man being treated as a criminal. In that instant, Jamal knew something was about to happen that would alter the course of his life. He didn't know how it would unfold, but the tension in the air was palpable. What he couldn't have known was how this confrontation, this wrongful arrest, would ignite a firestorm of consequences that would reverberate far beyond that street corner. The arrest would soon spiral into a nationwide conversation about police accountability, racial profiling, and the very system that was supposed to protect and serve. But for now, Jamal had to stay focused. He had to decide, should he fight back against this injustice, or would he allow it to unfold, hoping for some kind of resolution that wouldn't cost him everything? Jamal had always prided himself on his ability to blend into the background. His career with the FBI had taught him the subtle art of observation, of adapting to different environments and situations with ease. But in the small town of Northwood, blending in wasn't always as easy as it seemed. It wasn't just the town's geography, peaceful, almost idyllic, but its undercurrent of tension that Jamal had come to understand over the years. Northwood wasn't like the big cities he had worked in, where issues of race and policing were often debated in public forums, news outlets, and protests. Here, it was different. It was quieter. The tensions festered behind closed doors, hidden behind a facade of politeness and civility. Jamal's decision to move to Northwood had been influenced by a simple desire to escape the daily grind of city life, to find peace and focus. He had spent years working high-stakes undercover cases in urban centers where every day felt like a battle. After a decade of chasing criminals, dealing with informants, and trying to find the truth beneath layers of deception, Jamal was weary. His family, his wife Tara and their 2 children, had agreed that a change of pace was needed. Northwood seemed like the perfect place. It was an affluent community with a mix of working professionals, retirees, and a few small-town entrepreneurs. People here didn't expect much disruption. They lived their lives, went to their jobs, and kept to themselves. But even in this quiet town, Jamal had begun to notice the cracks in the foundation, the undercurrents of racial tension that few cared to address. He had lived in different cities across the country, from New York to Atlanta, and while each place had its own challenges, Northwood was different in a way that was hard to put into words. People here didn't always say what they thought, and the way they looked at Jamal spoke volumes. It wasn't overt racism, it was subtle, almost imperceptible at times. The way he was sometimes the last to be acknowledged in a room, how he was often met with awkward silences when he entered conversations, or the way people would glance over their shoulder when he passed by. Jamal had learned to ignore it, to keep his head down and focus on his work. But every so often, the feeling would creep up on him, the feeling of being an outsider, even in his own home. And then there was Officer Richards. Jamal had seen Richards around town. He had a reputation of being a tough, no-nonsense cop who prided himself on keeping the streets safe from trouble. He was a well-known figure in the local police force, a product of Northwood's traditional values, a man who believed in law and order, and perhaps more troublingly, in the preservation of the status quo. It wasn't that Jamal had any particular reason to dislike the officer, he had merely observed his behavior over time and, like many others, had heard rumors about Richard's views on race. The man's cold demeanor and tendency to act with a sense of entitlement when dealing with people of color were widely acknowledged. Still, Jamal didn't think much of it. He kept his distance, as he always did, focusing on his family and his work. But on that afternoon, as he stood there in the street, waiting for Officer Richards to return, Jamal felt the weight of the officer's suspicion bearing down on him. The longer the officer was gone, the more anxious Jamal became. He knew that something wasn't right, that this encounter was spiraling in a direction he could not control. Richards returned, and without warning, the situation escalated. The officer's demeanor had changed. There was an air of finality in the way he approached Jamal, and Jamal's instincts screamed at him to be careful. He watched the officer's every move, trying to gauge his intentions. It was clear that Richards wasn't just doing his job. He wasn't simply following protocol. This was personal. This was about more than just an identification check, it was about power. "I told you to stay put," Richards barked, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension in the air. He was leaning in now, closer to Jamal than before, almost as if trying to provoke a reaction. "You think you're above the law, don't you? You think because you wear a badge, you can get away with anything." Jamal's jaw tightened. His mind was racing. He knew what was coming. He knew that this officer, fueled by his own biases and prejudices, was about to make a life-altering decision. Richards was too far gone now, too entrenched in his own assumptions about Jamal to back down. The officer's words were no longer about Jamal's identification, they were about power, about control. He was trying to assert dominance, and Jamal had no choice but to stand his ground. "Officer," Jamal said, his voice measured and steady despite the rising tension, "I'm not resisting arrest. I'm not giving you any trouble. But you're making a mistake. You're about to make a very big mistake, and I'm asking you to think carefully before you take the next step." But Richards wasn't listening. His face was flushed with anger, his fists clenched at his sides as if ready to strike. You're not in charge here. I am. And you're going to jail. The officer's words felt like a blow, each syllable weighted with finality. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. He knew what was coming, but there was a part of him, no matter how many years he had spent in law enforcement, no matter how much training he had undergone, that couldn't accept this. This was wrong. It was unjust. He was a law-abiding citizen, an FBI agent for over a decade, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. It didn't make sense. His mind flashed to the hundreds of cases he had worked on, to the countless criminals he had brought to justice, to the lessons he had taught himself about fairness and equality. And yet, in this moment, those principles seemed distant like a forgotten dream. Jamal's thoughts were interrupted as Richards made a move. The officer reached out to cuff him, his hands grabbing at Jamal's wrists with a force that was unnecessary. In that moment, Jamal felt the full weight of the officer's power over him. He was just another black man in the eyes of Richards, another suspect to be dealt with, to be controlled. Jamal's instincts kicked in, and without thinking, he stepped back, his body reacting before his mind could fully process the danger of the situation. "What the hell is going on here?" a voice suddenly cut through the air. Jamal turned to see a neighbor, someone he had spoken to a few times, standing at the edge of the street, phone in hand, recording the entire interaction. The woman's voice was shaky, but she had the courage to speak out, to challenge the injustice unfolding before her eyes. Officer Richards froze for a moment, his eyes flicking to the woman before quickly returning to Jamal. The situation was no longer just between the two of them. It had become a spectacle. The tension in the air thickened, and Jamal knew that this moment, this confrontation, would not end quietly. The officer's eyes narrowed. He could feel the crowd gathering now, the weight of their gaze pressing down on him. "Stay back," Richards shouted to the woman, his voice laced with anger. "This doesn't concern you." But Jamal could see it, he could see the cracks beginning to form in Richards' carefully constructed facade. The officer wasn't as confident as he had been a few moments ago. The crowd's presence had shifted the dynamic, making Richards question his actions, if only for a fleeting second. Jamal knew that now was the time to act. "I'm an FBI agent," he said slowly, enunciating each word carefully, as if to cut through the thick fog of suspicion that had clouded Richards' judgment. He reached for his badge, pulling it from beneath his jacket, holding it up for the officer to see. But Richards didn't flinch. He didn't back down. Instead, he looked at Jamal's badge with a mixture of disbelief and disdain, almost as if he couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. "Nice try," he muttered, barely glancing at the identification. "I'm sure that's fake, too." The crowd was now fully engaged, recording, murmuring, and whispering in disbelief. Jamal could hear snippets of conversations, questions, and exclamations from the bystanders, but his focus remained on Richards. He was at a crossroads now, he had revealed his true identity, and yet the officer refused to acknowledge it. This wasn't just about an arrest anymore, it was about something much deeper, an abuse of power and the relentless grip of prejudice. Jamal stood tall, his heart racing, but he refused to back down. This wasn't just about his safety anymore. This was about the message that was being sent. The world needed to see this, to understand that this wasn't a one-off incident. This was a pattern, one that was rooted in a system that allowed officers like Richards to operate unchecked. As the standoff between Jamal and Officer Richards stretched on, the atmosphere around them seemed to shift, like the tension had physically thickened in the air. The crowd had grown, a handful of neighbors standing on their porches and sidewalks, cell phones raised and aimed at the two men. Jamal could hear the quiet murmur of voices from the onlookers, their murmurs a mix of disbelief and curiosity. It was as if they couldn't comprehend what they were witnessing, yet at the same time, they knew exactly what it was, a black man, an FBI agent no less, being targeted by a police officer who seemed unwilling to let go of his biased assumptions. Richards had his back up against the wall now. The officer, once so sure of his power, was slowly losing his control. The seconds felt like hours. Jamal's hand still gripped his badge, his palms slick with sweat, and his heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained focused. He knew he couldn't let this moment slip away. Not only for himself but for everyone watching. For everyone who had ever felt this kind of unjust scrutiny. He had to make this moment count. "Officer, please," Jamal said again, his voice even, though the inner turmoil was building inside him. "I've shown you my badge. I'm an agent of the FBI. I'm telling you, you're making a huge mistake." But Richards wasn't listening. His eyes were narrowed with distrust, and the anger radiating from him was almost palpable. "I don't care who you are," he spat, his voice low and menacing. "I've dealt with your kind before. You're all the same. You think you can walk around here like you own the place. You think just because you wear a badge that I should bow down to you. Not in my town." The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. They weren't just accusations, they were deeply rooted in years of prejudice. They were a reflection of a mindset that saw him, not as a person, but as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. It was a painful reminder that no matter how much he had achieved, no matter the badge he carried, some people could never see past the surface. To Officer Richards, Jamal wasn't an FBI agent with years of training and service. He wasn't a father, a husband, a man with a career and a life beyond this encounter. To Richards, Jamal was just a black man, and that was enough to label him a criminal. Jamal's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice steady, refusing to let the officer's words rattle him. "You're wrong, officer. You're making a dangerous assumption. I'm not a threat to you, but you are making me one. Do you really want to escalate this?" For a moment, Richard seemed to hesitate. His eyes darted to the crowd, the realization that he was being filmed perhaps finally sinking in. His posture shifted, becoming more defensive, his hand tightening on his belt as if searching for reassurance in the power of his uniform. But Jamal could see it now. Dominance, and Jamal knew there was no way to de-escalate this peacefully. He had tried. He had used his calm, professional demeanor to keep the situation from spiraling, but Richards wasn't interested in reason anymore. The officer's own insecurities had taken over, and that would be the undoing of this encounter. Jamal could feel the eyes of the crowd pressing on him. He had no choice but to act. He needed to de-escalate the situation, but there was no turning back now. As Richards lunged toward him, his hands grabbing for the cuffs once again, Jamal sidestepped with precision. The move was fluid, a product of years of training, but it was also a moment of survival. The officer stumbled forward, caught off guard by the shift in Jamal's stance. For a moment, there was a tense silence. Richards took a step back, his face reddened with fury, while Jamal stood firm, his feet planted in the dirt. The entire crowd held its breath. This was the moment. The moment where things would either escalate into violence or simmer down. The moment that would decide everything. Then, almost as if in slow motion, Jamal heard a sound that made his heart stop. Sirens. The unmistakable sound of sirens growing louder by the second. Jamal didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more threatened. More officers were arriving on the scene, but he knew this would either be the intervention they all needed or it would make everything worse. And then, in the distance, Jamal saw them. The backup officers. They weren't just coming to support Richards, they were coming to back him up, to validate his actions. Jamal's stomach sank. He knew that this was the critical moment where everything could spiral out of control. This was no longer about just one cop's bad judgment. This was about an entire system that had been built to protect officers like Richards, even when they were in the wrong. Jamal had reached a crossroads, and he couldn't help but wonder, how would this moment end? Would he be forced to confront the injustice head-on, or would his life, his career, and his identity be crushed under the weight of a broken system? The answer was not yet clear, but one thing was certain, his life would never be the same again. And neither would the town of Northwood. "I don't know what this man's talking about," Richards muttered, his voice tight with irritation. "He's not who he says he is. I know his type. Just another thug trying to play the system. I don't care what his badge says. He's still going to jail." Jamal clenched his fists, but he stayed composed. His patience was being tested, but he refused to let it crack. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about everything that had led up to this moment. Everything that had been buried beneath the surface of Northwood's seemingly peaceful exterior. He was standing in the middle of a system that was designed to protect people like Richards, people who used their power to push others down, to maintain control through fear and intimidation. And Jamal wasn't going to let that happen. He looked at the officers who had gathered, eyes wide and wary, but still mostly silent. It was clear that they were conflicted. They were seeing an FBI agent in front of them, someone who had earned his position and his place in law enforcement, and yet the tension between Jamal and Richards had reached a boiling point. The dynamics of the situation were clear, the backup officers were unsure of how to proceed. But Richards wasn't letting go. His ego and pride were too entrenched in this moment, and he wasn't about to back down. The seconds stretched on, and Jamal knew that he had only one choice left. He had to take control of the situation, not through force, but by shifting the narrative. He had to remind them of who he was, and more importantly, who they were. He could feel the eyes of the crowd upon him. He could feel the weight of their gaze, their silent judgment, but he wasn't just doing this for himself anymore. He was doing this for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. "I understand what's happening here," Jamal said slowly, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "I understand that you're scared, officer. But this isn't about you being in charge. This is about what's right. You're making a mistake, and I'm asking you to stop before things get worse." Richard's eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else there, too. It was the flicker of doubt, just for a moment. His gaze shifted from Jamal to the other officers, to the crowd, and then back again. For the first time, it seemed as if he was questioning his own decisions, questioning whether he was making the right call. But before anything could shift, the situation took an unexpected turn. A woman, one of Jamal's neighbors, stepped forward from the crowd. She had been quietly watching the scene unfold, her phone still recording, but now she was speaking up. "You can't do this," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "He's telling the truth. He's one of the good guys. He's not who you think he is." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Jamal saw Richards falter. It wasn't just the woman's voice, it was the collective pressure of the people around them, the people who had witnessed the injustice unfolding in front of them, who were now speaking out. This wasn't just Jamal's fight anymore. It was theirs, too. The officer who had spoken earlier, the one with the broad frame, glanced at Richards once more, and this time, there was a shift in his demeanor. The lines between right and wrong, between authority and abuse of power, seemed to blur in that instant. The officer's gaze softened, and he took a slow step back. "We need to sort this out," he said quietly, his voice almost apologetic. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Jamal could see it now, the fear in the backup officer's eyes, the unease that had crept into the scene. The moment had slipped out of Richard's control, and no amount of bravado could bring it back. The realization hit Jamal like a wave. This was the tipping point. He could see that Richards was no longer the confident officer he had been when he first approached Jamal. Now, Richards was cornered, not by Jamal, but by his own actions, his own refusal to acknowledge his mistake. Jamal stood there for a long moment, letting the silence linger in the air. The officers were still gathered around, but the dynamics had shifted. He wasn't just an FBI agent anymore. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system, a system that had turned a blind eye for far too long. But as the officers started to back off, as the crowd began to murmur in approval, Jamal realized that, despite everything, he had just won the smallest of victories. Richards may not have been willing to admit his error, but the seed had been planted. Jamal had made his stand, not just for himself but for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had ever faced the harsh realities of prejudice and power. And as the crowd dispersed, their whispers still filling the air, Jamal felt a strange sense of resolve. The fight wasn't over, but he had made his mark, and he knew this would be a moment people wouldn't forget. For once, Jamal was no longer just a man in a badge. He was the embodiment of the change that needed to come. The aftermath of that tense afternoon in Northwood settled over Jamal like an uneasy silence. The immediate chaos had subsided, but the air still felt thick with unresolved tension. Jamal stood there, his mind racing, replaying every moment of the encounter, trying to understand how it had unfolded. The crowd had dispersed, but he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He could already feel the weight of what had just happened, the implications of it all. Northwood had seen its fair share of drama, but this was different. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding between two individuals. This was about a system that had failed, not just him, but everyone who had ever been forced to watch in silence as their experiences were dismissed or ignored. The question now was, what would happen next? As Jamal drove home, the familiar streets of his neighborhood seemed foreign. He had walked these roads countless times, but today they felt different. The houses were the same, the trees lining the streets were the same, but everything around him now seemed tinted with a sense of heightened awareness. What had started as a simple mistake by one officer had grown into something much larger, a reflection of the broken system, the biases that existed within law enforcement, and the deep-seated fears that had been exposed by that one tragic moment. It wasn't just the incident itself that would stay with him, it was the realization that he couldn't walk through life pretending that things were normal anymore. Jamal turned into his driveway, the familiar sight of his house offering him a fleeting sense of comfort. He had a family inside, waiting for him. But as he stepped out of the car and walked up to the front door, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. His wife, Tasha, opened the door as he approached, her smile faltering as she saw the look on his face. "What happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern, her eyes scanning him as though trying to read the unspoken words. He didn't know how to answer. How could he explain to her that the day had turned into something he never could have imagined? How could he tell her that the system he had spent his entire career trying to support had almost swallowed him whole? That, in an instant, everything he had worked for, everything he believed in, had been called into question by a single encounter with a police officer whose prejudices ran deep? Instead, he simply sighed and hugged her tightly, trying to hold on to the peace he found in her embrace. "Jamal, what's going on?" Tasha asked softly, pulling away just enough to look him in the eyes. "I can see it in your face. You're not okay." "I'm okay," he said, though his voice betrayed him. He wasn't okay. Not really. The incident had stirred something in him, a sense of awareness, a sharpness that he couldn't turn off. The pain was deeper than just the confrontation itself. It was the truth that it represented. He was a black man, an FBI agent, and yet he had been treated as though he were a threat before even being given the chance to speak. This wasn't just about the officer's mistake. It was about a system that allowed these mistakes to keep happening, over and over again, without consequence. Tasha stepped back, letting him inside. The moment they walked into the house, the kids, Jamal's 2 young children, came running toward him, their faces bright with excitement. Their innocence, their joy, felt like a stark contrast to the darkness that had clouded his mind. He knelt down to hug them, but the hug felt strained, as though the weight of everything that had happened was pressing down on him, making the simple act of holding them seem difficult. After a few moments, Jamal stood up and motioned toward the living room. "Tasha, I need to talk to you about something." They sat on the couch, Jamal's mind still racing, trying to find the right words to explain what had happened. I've never felt more exposed in my entire life, he began, his voice low. I've always known the kind of biases that exist in this world, but I never thought I'd be on the receiving end of them. Not like that. Tasha nodded, her expression softening. She knew Jamal's job, the work he did for the FBI, and the dedication he had to his career. But this was different. She had always supported him, always stood by him as he navigated the challenges of being a black man in a profession that wasn't always welcoming to people who looked like him. But this was a wake-up call. The truth was hard to face, and even harder to explain to the people you loved. You've worked so hard to get where you are, Tasha said quietly, her voice filled with concern. And you've always believed in what you do. But sometimes it's hard to see how deep the problem really runs. It's not just about you, Jamal. It's about everyone who's been forced to deal with this. People like us. People who never get the chance to prove that we're different. That we're worthy of the same respect. Jamal sat back, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't been prepared for this moment. For the shift in his own perception of the world. You're right, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. It's not just about me. But I can't shake the feeling that nothing's going to change. Not really. I can't make them see me as anything other than what they already think I am. And that's what hurts the most. I've worked my whole life to prove I'm different, but the truth is, I don't think I'll ever be seen as anything but a threat. Tasha reached out, placing her hand on his. You've always been so strong, Jamal. But I think you've been holding a lot of this inside for too long. You can't carry it all on your own. It's not just your battle to fight. Jamal looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. She was right. This wasn't just his fight. It was everyone's fight. It wasn't enough to just try to survive within the system. He had to fight for the people who didn't have the same opportunities, for those whose voices were silenced by the weight of prejudice. He couldn't remain silent any longer. The next few days were a blur. Jamal went into work, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the images of the confrontation with Officer Richards, the fear in his children's eyes when he had come home, and the weight of the situation hanging over him like a dark cloud. But something had changed in him. He was no longer just a passive participant in a broken system. He had seen firsthand the dangers of unchecked power, the way bias could shape an entire encounter, and he wasn't going to let it slide. The FBI was supposed to be a place where integrity was upheld, where truth mattered above all else. But Jamal knew that integrity wasn't just about doing the right thing in the light, it was about fighting against the darkness that crept in when no one was watching. And that was the real fight. As Jamal sat in his office, reviewing reports, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from a colleague, someone he respected deeply. Jamal, I heard what happened in Northwood. I know you're going through a lot right now, but don't let this break you. You've been fighting this fight for years. You can't stop now. Jamal read the message over and over, feeling the weight of his colleague's words. It was true. He couldn't stop now. Not when so many others had never had the chance to speak up. Not when so many were still suffering in silence, buried beneath the weight of a system that had been built to ignore them. The fight wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever felt powerless. And Jamal was ready to face it head-on. Whatever came next, he would stand tall. For himself, for his family, and for everyone who had ever been told their voice didn't matter. The journey was just beginning, and Jamal was prepared to see it through. The following days after the incident in Northwood were a whirlwind of thoughts, emotions, and decisions for Jamal. He had always known that the line between right and wrong was often blurred, especially in the world he navigated as an FBI agent. But now, more than ever, he felt the weight of that line pressing heavily on his chest. Every decision, every interaction, felt like it was charged with more than just personal stakes. They carried the burden of systemic change, of confronting the undercurrents of prejudice and bias that ran far deeper than he had previously acknowledged. The feeling that this wasn't just his fight, but a fight for every black person who had ever been marginalized by the system, kept him up at night. Jamal found himself thinking back to his early days as an agent. He had entered the FBI with the belief that it was a place where justice and truth reigned supreme, where hard work and integrity were the foundations of everything they did. He had grown up in a community where he had seen both the best and worst of law enforcement, some officers who were genuinely dedicated to serving their communities and others who used their power to perpetuate injustice. He had always believed in the mission of the FBI, but now, in the wake of what had transpired, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been too naive. Had he been complicit by working within a system that had so many cracks, so many deep-rooted issues that were rarely addressed? It was a harsh realization, but one that he knew he couldn't ignore. Jamal had always prided himself on his ability to remain professional, to distance himself from the personal and emotional aspects of his work. But that moment in Northwood had shattered that separation. It had pulled him into a world of uncomfortable truths, forcing him to confront the very system he had sworn to uphold. He couldn't simply walk away from it. He had to fight, not just for himself, but for those who couldn't. The first step in this battle was figuring out how to channel his frustration, his anger, into something productive. Jamal knew that talking about his experience was important, but he didn't want to be just another person airing grievances. He wanted to make a difference, to spark a real conversation about the issues that plagued not just law enforcement, but society as a whole. It wasn't enough to simply call out the problem. The system was too vast, too entrenched. Jamal needed to find a way to be part of the solution. His first course of action was speaking out to his colleagues at the FBI. He had always been an advocate for transparency, for open dialogue, and now he felt the urge to bring those values into the forefront. He called a meeting with a few trusted colleagues, agents who had always shown an understanding of the challenges that minorities in law enforcement faced. It was in this meeting that Jamal laid it all on the table: the incident with Richards, the feeling of being targeted because of his race, and the stark realization that even within the FBI, systemic issues existed. To be honest, Jamal began, his voice steady but tinged with the anger that still simmered within him, I'm struggling to reconcile what happened in Northwood with what we say we stand for. We preach integrity, we preach justice, but I've seen the cracks firsthand. Not just in the street, but here, within the bureau. There was a brief silence in the room as the other agents absorbed his words. It wasn't an easy conversation to have, but Jamal knew it was necessary. He had spent years building a reputation for professionalism and excellence within the FBI, and now, he was using that credibility to speak up for change. One of his colleagues, Agent Lisa Harris, a woman of color who had been with the FBI for over a decade, spoke up. Jamal, I understand. We've seen this before. It's the same systemic issue that's been present in law enforcement for generations. But the reality is, change doesn't happen overnight. We've got to push from the inside, and we've got to do it strategically. If we're going to change this, we have to be the ones leading the charge. Her words hit Jamal hard. She was right. They couldn't simply rely on others to fix the problems they saw in the system. Change had to start with them, the agents who had the power to influence the direction of the FBI, the ones who could challenge the status quo. But it wasn't going to be easy. They had to navigate a culture that was often resistant to change, that was rooted in traditions that didn't always align with the ideals they wanted to uphold. The conversation continued, and Jamal could see the determination in the faces of his colleagues. They were ready to take action. But there was one challenge that hung heavily over the group: how could they push for systemic change without risking their careers, without putting themselves in the line of fire? The answer wasn't clear, but Jamal knew that he couldn't back down now. Over the next few weeks, Jamal threw himself into his work with renewed purpose. Every day, he used his position to highlight the flaws he had seen, to call attention to the biases that permeated the system, and to advocate for reform. He spoke at internal meetings, pushed for more diversity training, and worked with others to develop initiatives aimed at addressing issues of racial bias within the FBI. But it wasn't enough to simply focus on the internal workings of the agency. Jamal knew that real change needed to come from a broader movement, from the public holding law enforcement accountable for their actions. That's when he decided to take his experience public. Jamal was not one to seek attention, but he knew that his story could help ignite a much-needed conversation. He reached out to a few journalists, explaining his experience in Northwood and the ongoing issues of racial discrimination and bias in law enforcement. The first article that came out was both a personal and professional risk, but it was also a necessary step. He wanted the world to know that these issues weren't isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a much larger, more pervasive problem. The article quickly gained traction. Jamal's story resonated with people from all walks of life. His experience, though painful, was something many could relate to. It was a stark reminder of the reality many people of color faced on a daily basis, the suspicion, the profiling, the unfair treatment. But Jamal's story was also a call to action. He wasn't just sharing his pain, he was offering a solution, a chance for everyone to confront the systemic racism that still existed in law enforcement. Soon after the article was published, Jamal began receiving messages from people he had never met, activists, community leaders, and even other law enforcement officers who had experienced similar struggles. Some of them shared their own stories of discrimination and bias. Others thanked him for speaking out, for giving them a voice. It was both humbling and overwhelming. Jamal realized that by sharing his experience, he had given others the courage to do the same. But he also understood that this was just the beginning. As the days passed, Jamal began to see the effects of his actions. More conversations were happening within the FBI. Other agents were starting to open up about their own experiences, and the agency began discussing ways to address the issues of racial bias more seriously. Change wasn't happening overnight, but Jamal could feel the momentum building. There were still a lot of obstacles to overcome, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. His work, however, was far from over. As much as Jamal had accomplished, he knew that the fight for justice didn't stop with one article, one conversation, or one moment of clarity. This was a long-term battle, one that would require persistence, sacrifice, and a willingness to keep pushing forward despite the setbacks. Jamal had taken a risk, but it had paid off. And now, he was more determined than ever to keep fighting for the kind of change that would benefit not just him, but the entire system. His story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Jamal stood at the crossroads of something bigger than himself. He was no longer just an agent doing his job. He was a symbol of the struggle, a voice for those who had been silenced, and a catalyst for the changes that had long been overdue. Every day was a step forward, every conversation a piece of the puzzle. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jamal knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to back down. The fight for justice, for true equality, was far from over. And Jamal would be there, on the front lines, every step of the way.